Okay, this was a slide I had up the last time we talked about emotion last week. And I said that the unit would tend to look at these three sort of relations, although we won't really study intuition in a great detail, unless that's something afterwards that you guys want to study, because it's now considered by the IB its own separate way of knowing. But the first two for sure, like, okay, so now we've kind of come up with a bit of a definition for what emotion is. We've kind of studied it in a larger sense. And now we're going to look at it as an obstacle to knowledge and as a source of knowledge. So I think the obstacle one is the easier of the two, right? If you are emotional, how will that sort of stand in the way of you gaining knowledge? And the easiest way to pull an analogy out of that is if you're in school where you're supposedly gaining knowledge and you're highly emotional, you may not learn as well, using sort of similar language to describe the same scenario. Okay, so as it was just said in the video, emotions help influence our behaviors. So the first way is I'm going to show you how maybe we could look at how emotion distorts other ways of knowing, right? So for example, sense perception. So what if we have a very strong emotion? Could it affect our sense perceptions, right? I mean, we could use expressions like love is blind and fear has many eyes. That's a sort of a poetic way of describing it. But that maybe if we're highly emotional, like for example, if we are feeling in love with somebody or strongly attracted to someone, you might not visually see some of their faults, right? You might see and visually perceive some of the lovely things about them, right? Like how nice they smell, the great sound of their voice, you know, their cute smile and things like that. But if our emotion changes and suddenly we change from a feeling of love and attraction to the opposite feeling of something more along the lines of loathing for that person, now we're going to physically see things that we hadn't seen before. Like maybe their breath stinks and maybe they have a weird clicking sound when they eat. And you never noticed, like, I don't know, how dirty their fingernails were before, right? All of a sudden, it could actually affect our perception because perception goes through filters like we talked about before. And I would say one of those filters is emotional filters. I would make that argument. Now, what about reason? What about language? Well, I think reason is also an easy one to see, right? That I think if we are highly emotional, it's very difficult to put our brain into a reasoning state, right? It might be very difficult to do a very difficult math equation if you're extremely sad, right? If you're extremely happy and in a really silly mood, it might be difficult for you to put your reasoning skills into sort of action there. What about language? Obviously, I think language is part of emotion. Like we use language to express emotions, right? So this isn't a hard argument to make, that emotion could be sort of a standing obstacle towards gaining knowledge in the other ways of knowing, the ones we've already studied, okay? So now let's talk about the concept of a rationalization. I think you all should know what that word means. It's when we're in the course of being in the throes of a strong emotion and someone calls us on it, like saying, you're being too emotional, or you're not thinking rationally, or you're being, you know, whatever they say, we tend to rationalize what we're saying. And I'm going to show you a 6th century Aesop fable, which I think speaks slightly to this. I'll read it to you guys. A famished fox saw some clusters of ripe black grapes hanging from a trestled vine. She resorted to all her tricks to get at them, but wearied herself in vain, for she could not reach them. At last she turned away, hiding her disappointment and saying, well, the grapes are sour and not as ripe as I had thought. So I would position this piece of this fable as the fox was rationalizing why she couldn't reach the grapes. She was frustrated. She was frustrated that she couldn't get at the grapes, and then finally said, I didn't really want them anyways. I mean, and how many times have all of us done that? Where we put ourselves into an emotional state and then try to rationalize our behavior away because of the emotion. We don't say what we're really thinking, which is, well, I'm frustrated. I can't reach the grapes and I don't see a way around this. So instead of stating that, because our emotions are so high, we'll rationalize another conclusion out of this, okay? That what we're saying is that we tend to manufacture bad reasons to justify our behaviors. And according to psychologists, this is extremely common human behavior, that we tend to rationalize when there's a conflict between two or more of our beliefs, okay? This can also, a fancier word for this, for those who are maybe looking for a fancier sort of definition for this, maybe you've heard of this, some of this, since we're doing sort of academic things, is the idea of cognitive dissonance. Maybe you've heard of this before, okay? Where you can see here, a situation involving conflicting attitudes or beliefs or behaviors. So we have two things that we know should be happening at the same time, but they're in conflict with one another. So I'm going to give you this theoretical scenario. So imagine you smoke cigarettes, but you're also a fairly intelligent person and you realize that smoking cigarettes is actually pretty unhealthy for you. You know both of these things at the same time. You know that you like to smoke cigarettes and you know cigarettes are bad for you, okay? And this is a personal story for me. My dad died of lung cancer, right? So I know that cigarettes can be very, very bad for you. And my grandfather also died of lung cancer. I'm not a smoker, right? Just to state that up front here. So anyways, let's throw the scenario out here. So you have this knowledge. Cigarettes are bad for your health. You know that, okay? You also know that you are a smoker. Both of these things are true. You know you smoke cigarettes and you know cigarettes are bad for your health. This has put you into a state of cognitive dissonance. In other words, the two things conflict with one another. How can you hold both of those positions at the same time? So this is causing tension in you. You can't know you smoke cigarettes and know they're bad for your health and feel okay about that. It's going to affect you emotionally. So in order to relieve tension, to relieve the emotions, you could accept that smoking is unhealthy and give up smoking. Now you no longer have tension because you accept that smoking is unhealthy. And now by giving up smoking, the tension is relieved. But there is another way to relieve the tension. Another way is to question the evidence that smoking is bad for your health. That would also alleviate the tension, because now the tension would be gone because you don't have that cognitive dissonance anymore. And I'm using the smoking scenario because I think it's a pretty easy one to go into, but we could certainly apply this form of cognitive dissonance, this emotional conflict, to lots of different scenarios, including political ones. For those of you who enjoy talking about or writing about politics, you could easily make a reference here to some political thing where one supporter of a certain, say, political party believes in that party, yet it shows that this party is doing an action that maybe they are also in conflict with. So this idea of the two things in conflict, creating emotional tension that then has to be relieved in one of two ways. By relieving one of the two areas will help relieve the tension. Because we can't live in a state of cognitive dissonance. It forces us emotionally to kind of move on from that. All right. So this tendency for us to rationalize our decisions can also lead to something called a self-confirming belief system, or I'll have another word for it in a minute, another expression for it. But so let's say I start off right here, okay? That I see something, I perceive something through the biases and filters that I have, right? So again, let's say I'm a smoker and I perceive the fact that smoking is bad for my health and I start to question that. So this might lead to reasoning that uses some of those sort of logical fallacies that we were talking about. That I'm like, well, no, the evidence isn't what it is. And you start creating fallacies in the way you start to reason this stuff, not necessarily to other people, but to yourself. That you say, well, no, maybe the evidence and those tests that they did about cigarettes aren't accurate, and there's a conspiracy here that these things aren't the way. And when you start expressing this to other people, your language starts to pick up emotions. You start speaking emotively. There's an emotion to the way you speak. You use certain verbs and adjectives that are very highly emotive in nature. And actually, that type of emotive language, along with the reasoning, might actually lead you towards actually having those emotions, like we talked about. If you act a certain way, according to the James Lang theory, you might end up feeling a certain way. So your emotive language and the fact that you've been reasoning might lead you to actually feel those powerful emotions, which might lead you right back to being biased in your perception. So that strong emotion that you had at the start is now being reinforced and reinforcing your own perceptions. So this can create a cycle, okay? So another sort of fancy expression for this is something called a self-fulfilling prophecy. So here's a quick definition of what a self-fulfilling prophecy is, where a false expectation leads to its own confirmation. So an individual's expectations about whether something eventually will result in the person acting in ways that confirm the expectations. So if we expect something at the start, we might end up reasoning and talking and perceiving things that end up confirming what we believed at the beginning. Okay, and that's what a self-fulfilling prophecy is. And I feel emotion has a strong sort of role in that. And a simpler way to describe that is just a rationalization. Okay, here's another example. Henry has an emotional prejudice against immigrants. So he says, I don't like immigrants. I feel they're stealing all our jobs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Some sort of language like that. So he has this prejudice at the start. So it leads to a biased perception. As he drives around town, he notices only immigrants that don't have a job. And he doesn't see the ones that have jobs and are working really hard. His perception of his world is biased by his emotional prejudice against immigrants. He has fallacious reasoning. He makes things like the hasty generalization fallacy. He says, all immigrants are lazy. From his own limited experience and his own biased perception, he says all immigrants are lazy and ignores the ones that maybe aren't, okay? He uses emotive languages. He says things like, immigrants don't know the meaning of hard work. He says that out loud to coworkers. He says it to his family. The language then reinforces the emotion, okay, and continues to push the prejudice and reinforce it and rationalize the position he had, okay? It is a bit of what I call there a vicious circle. So rationalization, cognitive dissonance, self-fulfilling prophecy, all of those are ways to express how emotion can, in effect, distort our knowledge itself, okay? Now, on this slide, I talk about the concept of a fanatic, right? Someone, by definition, who refuses to question their assumptions and will absolutely not consider evidence that runs contrary to the way they look at the world. So once their position is sort of set, they will refuse to look at anything different. Here's what a psychologist says about it. A man with a conviction is a hard man to change. Tell him you disagree, he turns away. Show him facts and figures, he questions your sources. Appeal to logic, he fails to see your point. We have all experienced the futility of trying to change the mind of a strong, convicted person, especially if that person has the same some investment in the belief. We are familiar with the variety of ingenious defenses with which people protect their convictions, managing to keep them unscathed through the most devastating of attacks. Once you make a position and you stand by it, it is in a lot of ways humiliating to be proved wrong, right? If you made a stand and said the Jets are going to lose to the Oilers, and now evidence to the contrary is put in your face, it is embarrassing to know that. So people will defend their position and ignore contrary evidence because of emotional investments in this. Okay? Now, what this leads to is what I'm going to call in the next slide irrational behavior without using without using rational thought or reason. So not only can it distort our beliefs, but it now can lead to poor behaviors and poor decisions. That emotions can actually short-sight our reasoning, and that can lead to behaviors which could have long-term consequences. How many times have we all said in a moment of anger that we said something or did something that we regretted later, that we were so angry that we did something that we later regretted, or even maybe so happy that we did something that we regretted later, okay? And that if we could go back in time and try to control our emotions a little bit, exercise a little more self-control, we might have changed our behavior to something that was maybe a little more, quote unquote, rational, okay? So Aristotle himself, a famous philosopher, defined man as the rational animal, and that even our entire series of economics is based on the assumption that we are rational animals that produce and consume in a rational way. But that's not true, right? We have irrational behaviors even in the economics field. Here's Thomas Schilling's description of this. How should we conceptualize this rational consumer, who all of us know, and some of us are that consumer, who in self-disgust grinds up his cigarettes and throws them in the toilet? He says, I'm never going to smoke again. He says, I'm never going to risk making my children orphans because of lung cancer. And then 3 hours later is on the street looking for a store that's still open to buy cigarettes. Someone who eats a high-calorie lunch knowing that they're going to regret it, but doesn't regret it and doesn't understand. How did I lose control? I'm supposed to be on a diet. How did I eat that cheeseburger and milkshake when I'm supposed to be on a diet? Okay? How does this person rationalize their behaviors when they know it's not the right thing for them to do at the same time? So it is by definition an irrational behavior to be doing these behaviors that we rationally, using our reason, know is not the right thing to do. Okay? Okay, so I'm going to stop there today because that would be our next point, is now looking at emotion as a source of knowledge, not just a obstacle to knowledge. And I'm going to leave that for tomorrow's presentation of what we're going to talk about as we kind of finish up emotion, hopefully tomorrow. Okay, and if not tomorrow, we'll continue it next week. So I'm going to wrap up now with about just under 10 minutes left in the class. I'm just going to do a quick speaker check in case you guys have any questions you want to ask. But I want to also remind you guys of a couple things that you need to be kind of looking at, because I'm also going to make this announcement. By the end of the week, I want to start updating Power School with some updated marks for some of these units now, okay? So we're currently in the emotion unit, so I don't necessarily have to have that unit up in Power School yet. But if I look back to our last unit, okay, which if I go back here on our schedule, okay, back on Wednesday, May the 12th, we were looking at language, and we looked at on May the 13th, and then we wrapped it up. We wrapped up looking at language as a way of knowing. And yet, some of you still haven't completed all the things you need to complete for that language unit. Okay, now, to show you what those things are, I'm going to take a second to open up the handback folder. I'm going to open up one of the marking sheets of the language unit. I'm not going to open up anyone's in specific. I'm going to open one of, say, someone who had dropped the course, but I'm going to open up a language which will be empty, right? So it'll be an empty marking sheet. Okay, so if we go back to the language unit, okay, the good news is by just being in class, you did these activities. So that's good news. You don't have to do anything for the language unit in terms of handing materials in. The activities we did in class, and most of those were done before, actually I think all of them were done before we went to remote learning. But there's also a summative assessment here at the bottom that you need to fill out, that maybe some of you have not yet filled out, which was what I was pointing out right here on May the 13th. That document needs to be filled out for your marking sheet for that unit to be complete. But I want to step back one more unit. So that was one unit. Let's go back to the unit before language, which was sense perception, which we finished before we even went to remote learning. Now, this one, again, some of these things were definitely done in class, so that's good. One of these things, the summative assessment, again, some of you still need to do. So to find that, I'll show you where the link to that is in a second. But there's still one more activity here that some of you need to submit. And that's that thing I was talking about before remote learning started, which we started back in this unit on sense perception. And I continued it into the language unit, which was translating a piece of poetry into a piece of art. Now at this point, because we're on remote learning, what I would expect you guys to hand in would be a picture of the art at this point, because you can't actually physically hand in the art. I mean, you can if you want, come to the school and hand it in, but I want to make it easy for you guys. I just want you guys to submit a picture to me. You can submit it through email or through Teams or whatever way you feel is easiest for you, to submit a picture to me of that piece of art. I know some of you were able to physically hand it in before we went to remote learning, but there's still a significant number of you. And before I put that into Power School, I wanted to remind you guys of that. Okay, remind you of those documents, remind you of those planning documents. Okay, that's it. I'm going to turn off the recording now.